Hi everybody, welcome back to another video. I'm happy to be today reporting on Petrarch, His Life and Times by Hollway-Calthrop. Now this book was published a number of years ago. Well, this edition is 1972, but it was written originally in 1907. Believe it or not, it's more than 100 years old. Well, I suppose that's okay when you think about the fact that Petrarch himself lived in the 14th century, so I suppose that things don't age quite as quickly in that regard. Okay, Petrarch isn't as well known in the English-speaking world, obviously, as the Italian-speaking world. Petrarch was hugely important in the development of literature. He was a generation after the better-known Dante. Dante, of course, is the author of the Divine Comedy and one of my favorite works, La Vita Nova. And Petrarch was the next generation. Okay, so he's born in 1304 and died 70 years later, 1374. Petrarch, there's a number of things that are associated with Petrarch. The Petrarchan sonnet, for instance, is different from the Shakespearean sonnet, which is different from the, what am I thinking of? Well, there's different kinds of sonnets. Anyway, so Petrarch was, like Dante, was instrumental in the formation of modern Italian. And modern Italian was based on the Tuscan dialect, and Tuscany is that area of Italy that basically surrounds Florence. So the Great Florence, the center of Italian culture from Dante up to and beyond Michelangelo. Florence is the great center of Italian culture, not Milan and not Rome. At least we're talking about the late Middle Ages. I don't know if you know much about Italian history or geopolitics or whatever. Tuscany is that area between the very north, which is Milan, and that area which is called Lombardy, famous Tuscany, and below that you get the area around Rome. I guess it's called Romagna, and then you have the south closer to Sicily and all that. And back in the day, of course, there were different dialects spoken, and it's really funny how by the 19th century there'd be such a strong Italian unification idea, which is as strange, historically speaking, as the idea that Germany should be one nation. Historically speaking, Italy was never a unity, and it was never a failed unity. We have, of course, after the Roman Empire, we have Italy getting carved up by different groups, and one of them was the Lombards in the north, and they were not Italian. They had nothing to do with the people, the Italian people and the Roman people who were there. More Greek-y kind of people in the south, from Sicily, those great empires, and places associated with, like Ravenna, associated more with the Byzantine in the east. Italian had to be created, much like German had to be created and French had to be created. There are many dialects, and definitely as English had to be created. Obviously, Scottish people, Welsh people, and Irish people, and even people in England didn't all speak a common language, and that's probably pretty useful. That is, the difference between Italian dialects would be as strong as go to northern Scotland today and try to talk to the people, or try and read Chaucer. We're talking about this kind of difference of language. But the fame of Dante and the fame of Petrarch were instrumental in basically making the Tuscan dialect the Italian dialect. So what can I say about Petrarch? Petrarch, interestingly, I came to study Petrarch mostly because of my interest in St. Augustine and Augustinianism, and one of Petrarch's famous works is called the Secretum, or The Secret, and that is a dialogue which he wrote between himself and St. Augustine. Okay, so where he was imagining himself talking to St. Augustine. It's called the Secretum because Petrarch never published the work during his lifetime. It's too private, too personal. It's not that it's all that personal. It's in the modern day sense. It's personal in the 14th century sense. So basically, Petrarch was a fully alive man and poet, but also a very serious Christian, and he found a lot of sympathy with Augustine's model of Having had to deal with his libido, his sexuality, his desires, his, all that stuff. But Petrarch was very different from Augustine, but both, obviously beautiful intellectuals. And Petrarch picked up many good things from reading St. Augustine. And probably, I think, the best one was, or at least the most useful one, of course, was his interest in looking at himself as a subject matter of literature. Okay, what do I mean? I mean autobiographical. Petrarch is called the first best known man. There's no one before him that's revealed more about himself. So the previous first best known man was probably St. Augustine because of his Confessions. And Petrarch, 900 years later, becomes the next best known man. What does that tell us? Was he egocentric? I don't think so. He was humble, and he had, it's certainly possible, and I've read stuff which said, for instance, that Augustine was egocentric. I can't agree with that. It doesn't resonate with me, that interpretation. Was Petrarch egocentric? No, not him either. Petrarch was very sociable, but at the same time, he was very quiet and reflective, and his ideal was to live in a quiet sort of setting out in nature. So he had lots of connections with the papal court and with different kings and princes and dukes and all that stuff. And he was offered a number of important positions in the church, but he always refused them. And he didn't refuse them for the reasons of, say, for instance, Christian humility, like someone like St. Bonaventure did, or St. Francis, or whatever. He refused them because they meant taking him away from his primary love, which was writing, poetry. And he didn't just write poetry, he wrote a lot of prose, as I said. He wasn't a philosopher per se, but he was philosophical, as we see by the fact that he wrote that dialogue with St. Augustine. And I say with Augustine, I mean with a fictional St. Augustine. They lived 800 years apart. Petrarch was a young man at the time of Dante's death, for instance, and they probably met, believe it or not, since Petrarch's father was an acquaintance of Dante's. They're both from Florence. Neither one of them lived in Florence for very long in their lives, but they always considered themselves Florentine, just like someone would consider themselves French or American if their parents were, if they were born there, if that was their culture. So he was very attached to Florence, although he lived most of his life outside of Florence. Very little in Florence. He's one of his favorite places was actually the countryside outside of the then papal residence city of Avignon in France. So I don't know if you know about that, but for a short period of time, about 70 years, the popes abandoned the city of Rome and lived in the city of Avignon in France. And the reason is just Rome was so hostile, so dangerous in a way, and Italy was in such a political turmoil. So it was just simply safer and easier for the popes to move to Avignon, which was their territory, and it kind of meant that they were under the influence of the French king at the time. And about half of the cardinals in the church were French, and basically the other half were Italian. So what did Petrarch write? Again, he wrote poetry, he wrote a few prose things, he wrote some, well, as I said, he was mostly known for his short poems, his sonnets, which he wrote hundreds of, and they're beautiful even in translation. You can find a lot of them online. Maybe you can find them all, but I've only found a site that has a sampling of a number of them, and they're really, really, really beautiful. One of the things about Petrarch, it's easy to contrast Petrarch with Dante. Petrarch, and the reason, again, I'm sorry I keep saying this, but the reason I read Petrarch right now is for my research purposes. Petrarch is far more interested in nature than Dante. Dante is very much a theological poet, a Platonic poet, a philosophical poet, and less interested in nature itself and more interested in the big ideas, really. But Petrarch was like Dante in that whereas Dante had his Beatrice, Petrarch had his Laura. Now, some people say that Laura because it is too similar to the word laurel, which poets are, seek to be crowned with the laurel to show that they are the preeminent poet. Laura is not. That's what this specific biographer asserts, Hollway-Calthrop, that Laura was not a fiction. She was not a creation of his poetic imagination, but she was in fact a real person. The sonnets are just beautiful entries into his feelings about this Laura, but she played a very, I say, less a central role in Petrarch's life and imagination than Beatrice did for Dante. That might not be fair to say, but that's my impression. That's a similarity they had between each other, and that was really quite basic to the courtly romance feeling or genre or milieu at the time, was that a poet was supposed to idealize a woman. This was the whole chivalric code and so on. You never touch the woman, sometimes you never even talk to the woman, but she was worshipped from afar. And that was Petrarch's relationship with Laura. Unlike Dante, Petrarch kind of outgrew Laura, or at least outgrew his addiction to her. If that's not the right word, then I don't know which is. Petrarch grew up and became I suppose a serious Christian, a more stoical kind of guy. He was less passionate, at least extrinsically passionate, than Dante. There is development in Dante, and you can see this in, for instance, especially in the Purgatorio. Dante does grow up and does gain greater control of himself and his passions, but not in any, I don't think in a sense comparable to Petrarch's maturation. Petrarch, even in translation, is a beautiful poet, and it's his sonnets that are most read by us today. In translation, he wrote some longer works. He wrote longer works on, for instance, Scipio Africanus, the famous Roman general. Okay, so let's look at some other aspects of Petrarch's place in history in this sense. Petrarch, I think it's fair to say that Petrarch was really the father of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, of course, means rebirth. This is a rebirth of classical learning. Without going too much into the details or exaggerating, Petrarch, rather than Dante's sources were Christian sources. He loved Aquinas and all that stuff. Petrarch read and adored Virgil and Cicero. So like Virgil, he was very, very much influenced by Virgil's Eclogues, which is a long poem basically dedicated to nature, and his writing style and his philosophy of life, his morality, was very much influenced by Cicero, and his dedication to belles lettres, beautiful writing, comes from Cicero. And as I said, very much his spirituality is very much influenced by St. Augustine. But let's not forget, obviously, that St. Augustine was very much influenced by Cicero too. So the difference is pretty distinct here. Suddenly, Cicero becomes important again. For all the Middle Ages, these writers, these Roman writers, the ancient classical Roman writers, they had a very small place in a man's intellectual formation. Now, for as committed and serious a Christian as Petrarch was, he had a broader sense of of intellectual formation than, for instance, was standard for his generation and for the centuries before him. While things like writing style and beauty, contemplation of nature, all these things were acknowledged in theory, they played a very sort of minimal role in the literature and in the education of the people of the time. It's easy enough to see if you want to read, for instance, the chivalric romances, the Arthurian cycle. Nature plays a minimal role. It's not an object of contemplation, but for Petrarch it was. Beautiful writing style was something that was kind of a necessary evil in the minds of the preeminent educators of the Middle Ages. So even someone like St. Augustine, who was in a way the greatest authority in the Middle Ages, he kind of looked at writing style and said, looked at the dangers of it as being treated as an end in itself. When you put something like substance, when you put form over substance, then that's bad, right? So the truth should be the object of the writer, the thinker, the reader. Whereas the Greeks and the Romans, said Augustine, put too much emphasis on style, on form. And Augustine knew what he was talking about because that was his training as a young man. He was trained to be a stylist. And so much of the Middle Ages being a serious Christian spirituality of substance over form, Petrarch is kind of bringing in a revolution here in a way and saying that form is itself important. And it'd be exaggeration to say an end in itself. We're tipping the scale in the other direction. Again, for English readers, it's not that easy to get your hands on stuff on Petrarch. How many of us can actually read his poetry? It's very beautiful. Dante and Petrarch, their writing is very interesting because it's so particularized, if that's a word. There's so many small words and aspirations and so on. It will strike the English reader as very unusual in that sense, and very different from Latin in that sense. But reading Petrarch in translation, as I said, it is quite rewarding. And examining his life, the biography by Hollway is pretty good. Again, it's old and it's only 300 pages, and they're 300 easy pages. The book can be found in reprint. I've luckily somehow able to get a hardcover, but you can get in those reprinty versions. The book is good. It's a good introduction to Petrarch. I have a feeling that the author downplayed Laura's significance in his life. That I might be wrong about that, but that's the feeling I get. He only dedicates one short chapter to Laura, so I kind of have a feel that was the writer's choice, and perhaps not a proper reflection of Petrarch's life itself. But then again, the book is very good, it's very readable. It's important, I think, to know Petrarch's place in the development of the modern world as the father of the Renaissance, an interest in classical learning, in seeing the Roman and Greek sources as important in the formation. Now, in the centuries after Petrarch, it went without saying that young men studied Cicero in school, Cicero and Virgil, and this was the thing up until about 1900 or so. No matter what country you're from, you read and studied Latin poets. And sadly, we don't do that anymore. But, we can thank Petrarch for basically reintroducing Cicero and Virgil into the Western curriculum. So I said he was the first best known man in the world, and that is because he left not only things like the Secretum, but more importantly his letters. The different body of letters. He has the familiar letters, and he also has the letters of old age. There's hundreds of these. They're all in translation. They're published, and I think most of them are available probably online, and they reveal a great deal about him. Now, you say, well, what's so unusual about that? Well, the fact is, medieval people didn't like to talk about themselves. They had no tendency to talk about themselves. The tendency to talk about yourself is a very modern thing. To a medieval Christian, it was vanity par excellence to talk about yourself. But Petrarch was a reflective student of human life. This is what humanism means. The humanism that's at the heart of the Renaissance. Humanism means you study humanity, you study human nature. So Petrarch reflected on all these things, and I think that, even though most of us can't read Tuscan, medieval Tuscan Italian, that his writings are easily translatable and can be appreciated in English translation. So for all the great number of significant intellectual figures in the Western tradition, I point out to you Petrarch and hope that you will go online and read some of his stuff, some of his letters. He writes about, not only about love and nature and all that stuff, but he writes about poetry. He has theories of poetry, theories of writing and all that stuff. So he's a very interesting figure. I think one that is very likable by modern people in that sense. Anyway, have a great day, guys.